Welcome back into Live Now from Fox. I'm Austin Westfall. Let's get the latest on the Israel-Hamas war, and for that, we turn to national security analyst and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. As always, Hal, it's good to see you. Let's get into some of the headlines that we're covering this week. Reuters saying that Israel hit a Gaza school on Thursday with what it described as a targeted airstrike on several Hamas fighters that were inside. A Hamas official has said that 40 people were killed, including women and children sheltering at the UN site. I'll get to that in a second, the fact that that's coming from Hamas. But I want to ask you first, Hal, what more are the Israelis saying about what exactly was targeted here?
Austin, the Israelis are saying that that school, that UN school, was actually harboring about 30-plus terrorists, insurgents. They say they were Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and that if of course, if that's the case, then that's a lawful target under international law. Schools, mosques, hospitals, in general, are considered protected sites under the laws of war. They're not supposed to be targeted. However, if they're being used for military purposes, they lose that protected status, and that's what Israel's saying is they were being used for military purposes. Interesting, a number of bodies, if you will, have been recovered from that. They've been shown, but they're all shrouded. And it was very interesting that there was no attempt to show who was hit, and it certainly raises skepticism about the claims that women and children were hit when they basically leave all the bodies that were hit shrouded. So it does tend to reinforce exactly what Israel says, which is they were probably Hamas terrorists, Hamas fighters and PIJ fighters that were actually at the school building itself, which would make it a lawful target, although the UN has condemned it. Obviously, it's their school. Secretary Gutierrez has been very vocal about this, and generally attacking schools is not a good practice. But as we've seen throughout this conflict, Israel has hit a number of places that would be ostensibly protected sites because they're being used by Hamas for well, essentially military purposes.
How common are civilian casualties during any war? And does the IDF's recent activity seem to rise above what you'd consider regular wartime operations?
Well, that's the big international debate right now. You look at the sheer devastation, the amount of damage that's been done, and one wonders: is this are they overdoing it? I think the President Biden used the term "over the top" in terms of targeting. However, if you look at Gaza and then you were to juxtapose those against pictures of Bakhmut or Advika or certainly various other cities in Ukraine that have been attacked and fought over in the Russo-Ukraine war, you notice that it looks about the same in terms of devastation. Of course, the problem with Gaza, it's a very small area. It's the terrain is very limited. There's a lot of people in there. The density is significant, and it's the sheer amount of civilians that live in that area that make any war fighting there tough. And frankly, if you want to go back over 20, 30 years, that's one of the reasons that Israel has always avoided getting involved with a major ground war in Gaza, is simply because of the sheer density of the Palestinian civilian population that lives there, the urban density, and the difficulty in fighting in that sort of environment or that terrain.
So there's also been some reporting about the weapons in these strikes being U.S. made. Do you see that having any implications on the Israeli-American relationship as it relates to this war?
Well, I'm sure what it's going to do is the U.S. will be looking at an investigation to find out exactly what happened here. Anytime weapons are being used, they want to make sure they're being used in accordance with international law, with the international law of war. So they'll be looking at this. The Israelis have said immediately, that they do investigate these things when there are disputed claims, and it's the transparency of that investigation which is always looked at closely. It's not clear what intelligence drove Israel to target this particular site, And in that regard, Israel would probably want to protect its sources and methods of gathering that kind of intelligence. Of course, certainly Hamas and others would love to know how Israel gathers that type of intelligence. So there is a limit to the amount of transparency that can be done there. But certainly with U.S. weapons being employed in any situation, whether it's ordnance that's dropped from a plane or artillery or whatever, that the U.S. wants to make sure that it is being used. I know it sounds kind of strange because it's war, but lawfully under international law.
And then, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll read this, it was a Hamas official that said that 40 people were killed, including women and children sheltering at that UN site. That's not to say that civilians weren't killed, including women and children, but this leads me to something that you and I have discussed before, that sometimes the only numbers that we hear out of Gaza are from Hamas itself. Correct, Hal?
Well, this has been a challenge since literally October 7th. They only come from the Gaza Ministry of Health. The Gaza Ministry of Health is an arm of Hamas. I mean, the Hamas was the government in Gaza, and this is an element of that Hamas government that is in Gaza. They're the only ones that have been reporting numbers coming out of there. I think historians are going to look back and wonder from a strategic communication standpoint if Israel maybe missed something by not putting out a counter narrative or putting out their own numbers. Of course, the challenge is that in many cases when they do a strike, there is no way physically for the IDF to go in there and count how many people were killed. But there has been some very interesting statistical analysis done showing this constant level of death, if you will, of injuries from these strikes, yet wide variance in the amount of ordnance or the amount of strikes that take place on a day. But the Hamas numbers just seem to grow at a regular rate, and they always seem to have a disproportionate number of women and children that are hitting every strike. And just any basically superficial analysis would say that Hamas is making up a lot of numbers. They're just going in there and throwing out numbers. And of course, they probably have some statistic on the wall that says, by the way, every strike is mostly women and children. That's probably some rule they follow because that's what they always report. Now, again, I go back to this particular strike. Interesting that they left all the bodies shrouded. If there were women and children that were hit, I have no doubt that they would unshroud those bodies to make sure that the media, that they could take pictures, that they would put that out and say, look, these are innocent women and children that were hit. They have not done that, which tends to reinforce what Israel says, which was being used for military purposes, and probably these were military-aged men for the most part that were the basically the casualties that came out of that particular strike mission.
I want to ask a little bit more about Hamas's tactics. Let's pull up that tweet. So Hamas has seen about half of its forces wiped out in 8 months of war and is relying on hit-and-run insurgent tactics to frustrate Israel's attempts to take control of Gaza, according to U.S. and Israeli officials who spoke with Reuters. Hamas has been reduced to between 9,000 and 12,000 fighters, according to 3 senior U.S. officials familiar with battlefield developments. That's down from American estimates that are including about 20 to 25,000 before the conflict. So we're seeing a pretty significant decrease in the amount of Hamas fighters out there. So how have Hamas's tactics changed as this war has progressed?
Well, they've had to shift. Initially they were fighting house to house, building to building. They would be using obviously the underground network of tunnels and all the holes that they could pop up from to try and thwart the IDF advance. Well, the IDF is now all over Gaza. They haven't completely secured Rafah, but they are, by all reports, in downtown Rafah. They are moving across Rafah. One thing that's not getting a lot of reports is about 1 million. We've talked about before the Rafah operation, they had about 1 to 1.2 million, maybe 1.3 that were in that area, and that was a city designed for about 300 that had 300,000 or less before the war. Well, over 1 million, and it's not clear how much beyond 1 million, but over 1 million Palestinian civilians have evacuated. that area. So and within the Israeli press, they've been kind of talking about that as something of a big success, that evacuation. But what this means is, as Israel's pressing through, as they are clearing this territory, there just aren't those areas where the Hamas battalions, if you will, can make a stand. So what they're doing is they're trying to blend back into the population, classic insurgent tactics, and then pick and choose when they want to attack. Of course, for the IDF, that makes their situation that much more difficult, because their job is to try and separate the combatants from the non-combatants. Well, when your opponent deliberately blends into the population, which they kind of been doing all along, that's one of the reasons there is so many casualties. That's one of the reasons there's been so much collateral damage, is because that is a Hamas tactic. Well, when they take that particular tactic and then they put it on steroids, so to speak, to really blend into the population more, it makes it very challenging. And what this is migrating to is from clearing Gaza, destroying their military forces as a raid in an organized military manner, I should say, to now dealing with this insurgency across the Gaza region, smaller units, typical tactics or strikes that we'd associate with terrorist type things, as opposed to any sort of organized military type of thing. And that's what we're going to see. A lot of hit and runs. I think we just had a report of a small raid where they actually crossed the border to attack Israeli forces and reportedly killed one Israeli soldier. It was a small group of about 3 or 4, probably 3 as seemed to be the closest estimate of Hamas fighters that did that. They say they took out 2, 1 got back, but that's not a big military element. That's a very small element. That's more classical sort of terrorist type stuff, which is the typical tactics, techniques, procedures that you see employed in an insurgency, which is what this is migrating into.
Last thing I want to hit before we go here, everybody's talking about the ceasefire negotiation that's on the table right now. Biden, of course, announcing his phased plan for a ceasefire. He announced it in the back half of last week, and here we are today. We still haven't had any sort of deal struck. Has there been any significant news coming out of that front in the past 24 hours?
Well, interesting, there has been, and that is that the news was, there's no news, but the news was that Hamas has not responded to this proposal, which everyone's looking very closely. Now, we've talked before about the challenges within the political setting of Israel. Netanyahu has basically said that he wants to destroy Hamas. Secretary Austin today reframed it while he was at the Normandy D-Day, events. Basically reframed it saying, destroy Hamas militarily, kind of making that little differentiation there, as opposed to destroy Hamas. Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't quite make that differentiation. He says destroy Hamas. It's not clear what that looks like exactly. But with that said, they have not, the Israeli side, I should say, has not accepted this proposal yet, although I'm certain they're looking at it very closely. But everyone was wondering if Hamas was going to say, yes, we accept this, which would have put the U.S., certainly Egypt, Qatar, a number of Middle Eastern countries saying this is acceptable. Hamas is saying is acceptable. And within the Israeli political dynamic, that would have put phenomenal pressure on the Netanyahu administration to accept this as well, because certainly, as we talked about yesterday, those ultra-Orthodox parties within his coalition have actually said that they will support him if he accepts this ceasefire proposal, that's a significant step. And of course, one of his major opponents said he will actually backstop the coalition government under Netanyahu should those far-right parties that basically are kind of like absolutist parties that everybody's been kind of pointing to as this extreme side of Israeli politics, if they were to leave his coalition, that they would backstop that and keep the government from falling. Well, these are all significant moves in the background, which means that if Hamas was to accept this, as it's been proposed, then this would put tremendous pressure on Israel. And there were indications when this originally was brought out that Israel was somewhat amenable to what was being discussed. So the stage is set, although, look, you and I have been here how many times before where there's a proposal for a ceasefire on the table and it gets to this point and then everything just seems to collapse. And so I don't think anybody's placing bets in Las Vegas right now as to when this will be, this would happen. But certainly it has momentum, but we have to see what Hamas is going to do.
The only time we've seen a real deal struck was in the early months of this war, and nothing since then, Hal. All right, we'll leave it there for now. As always, we appreciate your insight. Take care and have a good rest of your night.